Welcome, dear listeners, to another peaceful journey with Voyage to Dreamland. Tonight, we invite you to settle into comfort as we explore a remarkable tale of human resilience and survival. Please take a moment to like this video if you find these stories of human endurance meaningful, and feel free to share in the comments any survival knowledge or similar stories that have inspired you. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these calming narratives to those seeking rest. As you prepare for sleep, allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Tonight's story takes us back to the early 20th century, to the vast Pacific Ocean where a man named John Rich found himself alone on a remote island following a devastating shipwreck. This is not merely a tale of survival, but a gentle exploration of the human spirit's capacity to adapt, endure, and find peace even in the most challenging circumstances. Let the rhythm of ocean waves guide you into relaxation as we begin this journey of discovery, resilience, and the profound connection between humanity and the natural world. In the year 1923, the merchant vessel Pacific Star cut through gentle swells somewhere in the vast expanse between California and the Hawaiian Islands. The ship carried cargo and passengers on what should have been a routine voyage across waters that had witnessed countless journeys before. Among the passengers was John Rich, a 34-year-old engineer from San Francisco, traveling to Honolulu on business related to the growing sugar industry. John possessed a steady temperament that served him well in his profession. His methodical mind approached problems with patience and careful observation, qualities that would soon prove invaluable in ways he could never have imagined. He spent his days aboard the Pacific Star reading technical journals and observing the endless horizon, finding a meditative quality in the ship's gentle rolling motion. The ocean stretched in all directions like a vast blue meditation, its surface catching sunlight and countless dancing diamonds. Seabirds followed the ship's wake, their cries mixing with the steady thrum of engines and the whisper of wind through rigging. John often stood at the rail during these peaceful moments, breathing the salt air and marveling at the ocean's immensity. The crew moved about their duties with practiced efficiency, their voices creating a comfortable background hum of human activity. Passengers gathered in small groups on deck, sharing stories and watching dolphins play in the ship's bow wave. Children pointed excitedly at flying fish that skimmed the surface like living arrows, their silver bodies catching the light before disappearing beneath the waves. As evening approached on what would be their final day aboard the Pacific Star, John retired to his cabin with a sense of contentment. The gentle rocking of the ship had become a lullaby, and he fell asleep to the soothing sounds of water against the hull, unaware that nature was preparing to test every aspect of his character and resourcefulness. The change began subtly, as nature's most powerful displays often do. John woke in the pre-dawn hours to a different rhythm in the ship's movement, a more pronounced rolling that spoke of building seas. Through his porthole, he could see the sky had taken on a peculiar greenish cast, with clouds moving in patterns that seemed almost alive. The barometric pressure dropped steadily throughout the morning, creating an almost tangible heaviness in the air. Experienced sailors among the crew exchanged knowing glances as they secured loose items and checked the rigging with extra care. The ocean itself seemed to sense the approaching disturbance, its surface taking on an oily quality that reflected the strange light in unsettling ways. By midday, the wind had begun to sing through the ship's superstructure with increasing intensity. Waves that had been gentle swells now rose to impressive heights, their crests beginning to show the white foam that indicated serious weather ahead. The Pacific Star rode these growing seas with the dignity of a well-built vessel, but even her sturdy construction could not completely mask the ocean's growing restlessness. Passengers gathered in the main salon, finding comfort in each other's company as the ship's motion became more pronounced. Conversations turned to shared experiences of storms at sea, with older travelers offering reassuring stories of rough passages safely weathered. The ship's officers maintained their professional calm, but John noticed the increased frequency of their consultations and the careful way they monitored their instruments. As afternoon faded into an eerily early twilight, the storm revealed its true nature. Rain began to fall in sheets so dense they seemed solid, drumming against windows and deck with a sound like continuous applause. The wind rose to a howl that penetrated even the ship's thick walls, and the Pacific Star began to labor against seas that had transformed from rolling hills into moving mountains of dark water. The storm struck with the full fury of the Pacific's untamed power sometime after midnight. John was thrown from his bunk as the ship rolled to an angle that seemed impossible, her hull groaning with the stress of forces beyond human comprehension. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power system struggled against the storm's assault, casting everything in an otherworldly red glow. The sound was overwhelming, not just the wind's shriek or the crash of waves against the hull, but the deep, resonant groaning of metal under stress, the sharp crack of breaking glass, and the confused shouts of passengers and crew trying to make sense of chaos. John pulled on his clothes and life jacket with the methodical calm that was his nature, even as the world tilted and swayed around him. In the corridors, he encountered other passengers, their faces showing the controlled fear of people trying to maintain dignity in the face of forces beyond their control. The ship's crew moved with purpose despite the impossible conditions, their training evident in every action as they worked to keep their vessel and passengers safe. The Pacific Star fought valiantly against the storm's assault, her engines straining to maintain headway against waves that towered above her superstructure. Each impact sent shudders through her frame, and with each passing hour, the sounds of stress grew more pronounced. Mental fatigue was setting in, and even the most optimistic among the crew began to prepare for the possibility that their ship might not survive the night. John found himself on deck despite the danger, drawn by some instinct to witness the storm's full power. Secured by safety lines, he watched in awe as waves the size of buildings marched past in endless procession, their faces steep and threatening. The wind stripped the breath from his lungs and filled his ears with a sound like the world ending, yet somewhere in the chaos, he found a strange peace in accepting forces far greater than human will or engineering. The end came not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the gradual surrender of metal and wood to forces they were never designed to withstand. Around 3 a.m, a wave larger than all the others struck the Pacific Star amidships, and John felt something fundamental change in the ship's response. The groaning of stressed metal reached a crescendo, and then came a sound like thunder as the hull began to fail. The ship's death throes were surprisingly brief. Within minutes of the fatal impact, it became clear that the Pacific Star was lost. The crew, trained for this possibility but hoping never to face it, began the process of abandoning ship with remarkable efficiency despite the impossible conditions. Lifeboats were prepared and passengers mustered, though the storm made every action a battle against wind and water. John found himself assigned to lifeboat number 3, along with 12 other passengers and 2 crew members. The process of launching the boat in such conditions was harrowing, requiring precise timing between the ship's roll and the height of the waves. As they were lowered toward the churning water, John caught his last glimpse of the Pacific Star, her lights still burning bravely as she settled deeper into the angry sea. The lifeboat hit the water with a shock that sent spray over everyone aboard. Immediately, they were in a different world. No longer protected by the ship's bulk, they felt the full power of the storm. Waves that had seemed large from the ship's deck now towered above them like moving walls, and the small boat rode their slopes like a cork in a washing machine. For hours, they fought to keep the boat upright and pointed into the waves. The two crew members, both experienced seamen, worked tirelessly at the tiller and with the sea anchor, while passengers bailed water and held on against the boat's violent motion. John used his engineer's mind to help coordinate their efforts, finding purpose in the mechanical aspects of survival even as the storm raged around them. The storm began to weaken with the approach of dawn, its fury gradually subsiding to reveal a world transformed. The sea, while still rough, no longer showed the white-capped violence of the night hours. Gray light filtered through breaking clouds, and for the first time in many hours, those in the lifeboat could see beyond the next wave crest. It was then that John realized he was alone. Sometime during the final hours of the storm, while he had dozed fitfully in the boat's stern, the others had vanished. Whether they had been swept overboard by a rogue wave or had deliberately abandoned the damaged boat for another they thought more seaworthy, he would never know. The lifeboat, partially swamped and riding low in the water, contained only John and the essential supplies that had been secured in waterproof compartments. The silence was profound after the storm's cacophony. Only the gentle slap of waves against the boat's hull and the distant cry of seabirds broke the morning quiet. John took inventory of his situation with the same methodical approach he brought to engineering problems. The boat was damaged but seaworthy. He had basic supplies including water and emergency rations, and most importantly, he was alive and uninjured. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the storm clouds, John began to understand the full scope of his situation. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, showing no sign of other survivors or rescue vessels. The Pacific Star had gone down in waters far from shipping lanes, and the storm had likely scattered any other lifeboats across hundreds of square miles of open ocean. Yet rather than despair, John felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the natural response of a mind trained to solve problems rather than be overwhelmed by them. He had survived the storm, he had supplies, and he had the knowledge and temperament needed to face whatever came next. The ocean that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now appeared almost peaceful in the morning light, its surface catching the sun in patterns that seemed to dance with possibility rather than menace. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, transforming the ocean's surface into a vast mirror that reflected clouds and sky in perfect symmetry. John found himself mesmerized by the interplay of light and water, the way each wave caught and scattered sunbeams into countless dancing points of brilliance. The rhythmic motion of his small craft created a hypnotic cadence that seemed to slow time itself, each rise and fall marking moments in a new kind of existence. He began to understand the ocean's moods in ways he had never considered during his comfortable passage aboard the Pacific Star. The water spoke in whispers and murmurs, telling stories of currents and weather patterns, of the deep places where sunlight never reached and the surface where life danced in endless cycles. Flying fish occasionally broke the surface near his boat, their translucent fins catching the light like stained glass windows before they disappeared back into their liquid world. The emergency rations in the lifeboat were carefully rationed, each meal a small ceremony that marked the passage of time. John discovered that hunger, when accepted rather than fought, became a teacher of patience and appreciation. A single biscuit, eaten slowly while watching the play of light on water, became a feast for senses heightened by necessity and solitude. As the day progressed, he began to notice the subtle signs that spoke of land somewhere beyond the horizon. Seabirds appeared with increasing frequency, their flight patterns suggesting they were traveling to and from roosting places not too distant. Pieces of vegetation floated past occasionally, not the deep-sea kelp that might drift for thousands of miles, but fresher plant matter that spoke of recent contact with soil and growing things. The afternoon brought a gentle wind that filled the small sail John had rigged from canvas found in the boat's emergency kit. His engineering background served him well in understanding the principles of wind and water, and he found a deep satisfaction in coaxing maximum efficiency from his simple sailing rig. The boat responded to his adjustments with the eager cooperation of a living thing, and together they began to make steady progress toward whatever lay beyond the endless blue horizon. The second day brought confirmation of what John had begun to suspect. Somewhere ahead lay land. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to eyes that had learned to read the ocean's language. The water itself seemed different, carrying scents and colors that spoke of shallow places where sunlight reached the bottom and coral gardens bloomed in tropical abundance. Birds became his most reliable guides, their behavior patterns revealing the invisible geography of the sea. Frigate birds soared overhead with the confidence of creatures that knew exactly where they were going, their black silhouettes cutting sharp lines against the blue sky. Smaller seabirds dove for fish in waters that showed the telltale signs of upwelling currents, those underwater rivers that brought nutrients from the deep and created oases of life in the ocean desert. The water's color began to change as the day progressed, shifting from the deep blue of oceanic depths to the lighter shades that indicated shallower seas. John's engineer's eye caught these subtle variations long before they became obvious, and he adjusted his course accordingly, following the birds and the water's changing hues toward whatever sanctuary awaited. Cloud formations on the horizon told their own story, building in patterns that suggested land masses heating under the tropical sun. These thermal columns created their own weather systems, drawing moisture from the sea and releasing it as the brief, intense showers that nourished island ecosystems. John watched these distant clouds with the intensity of a navigator, reading in their shapes and movements the promise of solid ground. As evening approached, the scent of land became unmistakable, a green, growing smell that spoke of vegetation and soil, of places where fresh water met the sea and created the conditions for life to flourish. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere in that direction, John knew, lay his destination. The ocean that had seemed so vast and empty now felt like a highway leading him home to a place he had never seen. Dawn of the third day revealed what John had been hoping to see, a thin line of green on the horizon that gradually resolved itself into the unmistakable silhouette of a tropical island. Palm trees swayed against the morning sky, their fronds catching the early light like natural flags welcoming the solitary traveler. The sight filled him with a quiet joy that seemed to resonate in harmony with the gentle lapping of waves against his boat's hull. As he drew closer, the island revealed its character in layers of increasing detail. A coral reef surrounded much of its perimeter, creating a natural breakwater where waves spent their energy in fountains of white spray. Beyond the reef, a lagoon of the most extraordinary blue-green color stretched toward a beach of sand so white it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The contrast between the deep ocean blue and the lagoon's turquoise created a visual symphony that spoke of paradise found. The island itself rose gently from the beach, clothed in vegetation that ranged from coconut palms along the shore to denser tropical forest in the interior. John could see a small stream cutting through the beach where fresh water met the sea, creating the kind of ecological richness that promised both beauty and the resources necessary for survival. Birds called from the forest canopy, their voices adding a musical counterpoint to the eternal rhythm of waves on coral. Finding a passage through the reef required patience and careful observation. John studied the water's color and movement, looking for the deeper channels that would allow his boat safe passage. The reef was a living thing, built by countless generations of coral polyps into a structure more complex and beautiful than any human architecture. Fish of every imaginable color darted through the coral gardens, their movements creating flashes of brilliance in the crystal-clear water. When he finally guided his boat through a narrow channel and into the protected lagoon, John felt as though he had entered a different world entirely. The water was so clear he could see every detail of the sandy bottom 20 feet below, decorated with coral heads and seagrass beds that swayed in the gentle current. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of waves on the outer reef and the soft whisper of trade winds through palm fronds. The moment when John's feet touched the sand of the beach marked a transition as significant as any in human experience, from the uncertainty of the sea to the promise of solid ground. The sand was warm and fine, composed of countless fragments of coral and shell ground smoothed by centuries of wave action. Each step left a clear impression in this pristine surface, the first human footprints this particular stretch of beach had ever known. The immediate sensation was one of profound stability after days of constant motion. The ground beneath his feet remained reassuringly still, allowing his sea-weary body to remember what it meant to stand without swaying. He pulled his small boat well up onto the beach, securing it above the high tide line with the care of someone who understood that this simple craft might represent his only means of eventual rescue. The beach stretched in both directions, a perfect crescent of white sand bordered by coconut palms that leaned at graceful angles toward the sea. Behind the palms, the island's interior beckoned with the green promise of fresh water, shelter, and the resources necessary for extended survival. The air was warm and humid, carrying the mingled scents of salt spray, tropical flowers, and the rich earthiness of a living ecosystem. John's first priority was fresh water, and the small stream he had observed from the sea proved to be everything he had hoped. It emerged from the island's interior as a clear spring, flowing over smooth stones and creating small pools before finally reaching the sea. The water was cool and sweet, tasting of rain and volcanic soil, and John drank deeply while giving thanks for this most essential of discoveries. As he explored the immediate area around his landing site, John began to appreciate the island's generous provision for human survival. Coconut palms heavy with fruit promised both food and drink, while breadfruit trees and other tropical species suggested a natural abundance that could sustain him indefinitely. The island seemed to welcome him with open arms, offering everything necessary for not just survival, but a kind of peace he had never experienced in his previous life. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, John prepared for his first night on solid ground in what felt like a lifetime. The transition from the constant motion of the sea to the profound stillness of land created a sense of peace that seemed to settle into his very bones. Every breath carried the rich sense of tropical vegetation and the subtle perfume of flowers that bloomed unseen in the island's interior. He chose a spot for his first camp with the careful consideration of someone who understood that small decisions could have large consequences. A grove of coconut palms near the stream provided both shelter and easy access to fresh water, while remaining close enough to the beach to maintain visual contact with his boat and any potential rescue vessels that might appear on the horizon. The process of creating shelter became a meditation on human adaptability and the generous provision of nature. Palm fronds, when properly woven together, created walls that could turn wind and rain while allowing cooling breezes to pass through. The engineering principles John had learned in his professional life translated surprisingly well to this more primitive construction, and he found deep satisfaction in creating something functional and beautiful using only materials the island provided. As darkness fell, the island revealed its nocturnal character. The sound of waves on the distant reef created a constant, soothing background rhythm, while closer at hand, the stream murmured its way toward the sea with the gentle persistence of water following gravity's ancient call. Night birds called from the forest canopy, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of an ecosystem in perfect balance. The stars, unobscured by any artificial light, revealed themselves in all their magnificent abundance. John lay on his bed of woven palm fronds, looking up at constellations that seemed close enough to touch, and felt a profound connection to the natural world that his previous life had never allowed. The Southern Cross hung low in the sky, its familiar pattern providing both beauty and navigational reference, while the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light flowing through infinite darkness. The first dawn on the island arrived with a symphony of sound and color that seemed orchestrated by nature herself. John woke to the gentle chorus of tropical birds greeting the sunrise, their varied calls creating a natural alarm clock more pleasant than any he had ever experienced. The air was soft and warm, carrying the mingled fragrances of salt spray and blooming flowers, while gentle trade winds rustled through the palm fronds above his makeshift shelter. The sunrise itself was a masterpiece painted across the eastern sky, beginning with the faintest hint of gray that gradually warmed to pink, then gold, and finally the brilliant orange-red of the tropical sun breaking free of the horizon. The lagoon caught and reflected these colors, creating a double sunrise that filled the world with light from both above and below. John stood at the water's edge, watching this daily miracle unfold, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for being alive to witness such beauty. His morning routine began to establish itself with the natural rhythm of someone learning to live in harmony with the cycles of sun and tide. The stream provided fresh water for drinking and washing, its cool flow a refreshing contrast to the warming air. Coconuts, once he mastered the technique of opening them, offered both sweet milk and nutritious meat, while the clear lagoon promised an abundance of fish and other marine life. The island revealed more of its character as John explored beyond his initial campsite. Paths worn by generations of seabirds led through groves of breadfruit and other tropical trees, their branches heavy with fruit that would ripen in natural succession throughout the year. The interior rose gently toward a central ridge, clothed in forest that promised both resources and the kind of natural air conditioning that would make the tropical heat bearable. As the morning progressed, John began to understand that his survival would depend not on fighting against this environment, but on learning to work with its natural rhythms. The island operated according to principles far older than human civilization, and his task was to find his place within these ancient patterns rather than trying to impose his will upon them. This realization brought with it a sense of peace that seemed to flow from the very ground beneath his feet. Living so close to the sea, John quickly became attuned to the eternal rhythm of the tides, that ancient dance between moon and ocean that had marked time long before humans walked the earth. High tide brought the lagoon's waters nearly to the edge of the palm grove, creating temporary pools among the coral heads where small fish gathered in silver schools that flashed and turned as one living entity. At low tide, the lagoon revealed secrets hidden beneath its surface during the fuller hours. Coral gardens emerged like underwater cities, their inhabitants scurrying for deeper water or hiding in tidal pools that became temporary worlds complete with their own ecosystems. John learned to time his fishing and foraging activities to these natural cycles, finding that the island's bounty was most accessible to those who understood its rhythms. The twice-daily transformation of the shoreline became a source of endless fascination. What had been swimming depth at morning might be exposed coral and sand by afternoon, revealing shells and sea creatures that had been invisible just hours before. Each tide brought new treasures. Pieces of driftwood worn smooth by countless miles of ocean travel, shells of extraordinary beauty and complexity, and occasionally, useful items that had been lost from distant ships and carried here by currents that connected this small island to the wider world. John established his daily routine around these tidal cycles, rising before dawn to fish in the deeper water of high tide, then using the low tide hours for gathering shellfish and exploring the exposed reef flats. The predictability of these cycles provided a comforting structure to his days, a natural clock that required no winding and never failed to mark the passage of time with reliable precision. The sound of waves on coral became the soundtrack of his existence, a constant rhythm that varied with tide and weather but never completely ceased. During calm periods, it was a gentle murmur that seemed designed to promote peaceful sleep. When trade winds strengthened, it became a more vigorous percussion that spoke of the ocean's endless energy. John found that he could read the weather in these sounds, predicting changes in wind and sea conditions hours before they became visually apparent. Beyond the beach and its fringe of coconut palms lay the island's interior forest, a green world that seemed to exist in a different dimension of time and light. Here, beneath a canopy so dense it filtered the tropical sun into a soft, green-tinted twilight, John discovered an ecosystem of remarkable complexity and beauty. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks draped with vines and epiphytes that created vertical gardens reaching toward the distant canopy. The forest floor was a carpet of fallen leaves and decomposing vegetation that released the rich, earthy scent of tropical soil. Every footstep released new fragrances. The spicy smell of crushed ginger plants, the sweet perfume of fallen flowers, and the clean, green scent of moss and ferns that thrived in the humid air. The temperature here was noticeably cooler than on the beach, creating a natural refuge from the intensity of the tropical sun. Bird calls echoed through the forest with an acoustic quality that seemed designed by nature herself. The dense vegetation created perfect sound chambers that carried the songs of unseen birds across surprising distances, while filtering out harsh sounds and leaving only the most musical tones. John often paused during his explorations simply to listen to these natural concerts, finding in them a peace that seemed to flow directly into his soul. Streams appeared and disappeared throughout the forest, sometimes flowing openly over beds of smooth stones, sometimes disappearing underground only to emerge again as springs or small waterfalls. These waterways created their own microclimates, supporting different plant communities and providing the constant, soothing sound of moving water that seemed to slow time itself. John followed these streams like natural highways, knowing they would eventually lead him back to the sea while revealing the island's hidden treasures along the way. The forest provided an abundance of resources for someone willing to learn its lessons. Bamboo groves offered material for construction and tools, while various fruit trees promised sustenance throughout different seasons. Medicinal plants grew in profusion, their healing properties encoded in traditional knowledge that John began to discover through careful observation and cautious experimentation. The forest was not just a source of materials, but a teacher of patience, observation, and the interconnectedness of all living things. As days turned into weeks, John's temporary shelter evolved into something more permanent and comfortable. Using techniques that combined his engineering knowledge with principles learned from observing how nature solves similar problems, he constructed a dwelling that seemed to grow organically from its surroundings. Bamboo provided the structural framework, while palm fronds and other natural materials created walls and roofing that could shed rain while allowing cooling breezes to flow through. The process of construction became a form of meditation, each task requiring careful attention to detail and patient craftsmanship. Lashing bamboo poles together with fibers extracted from coconut husks required a rhythm and technique that could not be rushed. John discovered that the work itself was as important as the result, providing structure to his days and a sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere survival. His tools evolved from simple implements fashioned from whatever materials the island provided to more sophisticated devices that reflected both necessity and growing skill. Sharp shells became knives, while pieces of coral could be shaped into effective scrapers and grinding surfaces. Bamboo, with its natural hollow structure, provided containers for water and storage, while its solid sections could be carved into hooks, needles, and other essential implements. The kitchen area of his growing homestead centered around a fire pit lined with coral stones, positioned to take advantage of prevailing breezes for both cooking efficiency and smoke dispersal. John learned to maintain a constant supply of dry tinder and kindling, understanding that fire was not just a convenience but a crucial element of survival that required constant attention and respect. The evening ritual of banking coals to preserve fire through the night became as natural as breathing. Food preparation evolved from simple survival feeding to something approaching culinary art. Fish could be grilled over open flames, wrapped in leaves and steamed in underground ovens, or dried in the sun for long-term storage. Fruits and vegetables from the forest required different treatments. Some needed cooking to be digestible, others were best eaten fresh, and many could be processed into forms that would keep for extended periods. Each meal became an experiment in combining available ingredients into something both nutritious and satisfying. In the profound solitude of his island existence, John discovered aspects of himself that had remained hidden during his previous life surrounded by the constant noise and distraction of civilization. Without the endless demands of schedules, meetings, and social obligations, his mind began to settle into rhythms more closely aligned with the natural world around him. Thoughts that had once raced through his consciousness now moved with the measured pace of tides and seasons. The absence of human conversation led to a different kind of dialogue, one conducted with the island itself through careful observation and patient listening. The morning chorus of birds became a daily briefing on weather conditions and seasonal changes. The behavior of fish in the lagoon provided information about tidal conditions and the presence of larger predators in deeper waters. Even the rustling of palm fronds carried messages about wind direction and the approach of weather systems. Memory took on new significance in this environment where external stimulation was limited to the natural world. John found himself revisiting experiences from his past with a clarity and depth that had been impossible amid the rush of daily life. Conversations with friends and family replayed in his mind with perfect fidelity. while technical knowledge from his engineering career proved surprisingly applicable to the challenges of island survival. The concept of time itself began to transform under the influence of natural cycles. Days were measured not by clock hours but by the position of the sun and the state of the tide. Weeks flowed together in patterns determined by weather and the ripening of different fruits. Months became meaningful only in terms of seasonal changes. The gradual shift in wind patterns, the varying intensity of rainfall, and the cyclical abundance of different food sources. This new relationship with time brought with it a profound sense of peace that John had never experienced in his previous life. Without deadlines and appointments, each moment could be fully experienced rather than rushed through on the way to the next obligation. The simple act of watching a sunset became an event worthy of complete attention, while the sound of rain on palm fronds could provide entertainment for hours. In learning to live more slowly, John discovered that life itself became richer and more meaningful. Living in such intimate contact with the natural world, John developed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle signs that preceded changes in weather. The island's position in the vast Pacific made it a crossroads for weather systems that could shift from gentle trade winds to powerful storms with little warning. Learning to interpret these signs became not just a matter of comfort, but of survival itself. The morning sky told stories that extended far beyond the immediate day ahead. High, wispy cirrus clouds streaming from the west often preceded weather changes by 48 hours or more, their delicate patterns painting messages across the blue canvas of sky. The color and intensity of sunrise and sunset provided additional clues. Brilliant red sunsets often meant clear weather ahead, while pale, washed-out colors could indicate approaching storms. The behavior of birds became John's most reliable weather forecasting system. Seabirds that normally fed far from shore would return early when sensing atmospheric pressure changes that preceded storms. The forest birds altered their calling patterns before weather shifts, becoming unusually quiet before major changes or singing with increased intensity when high-pressure systems brought stable conditions. Even the insects seemed to respond to barometric changes, with mosquitoes becoming more active before rain and disappearing entirely when strong winds approached. The ocean itself provided the most dramatic weather indicators. Swells from distant storms would arrive hours or even days before the weather systems that created them, causing changes in wave patterns that John learned to read like a maritime language. The color of the water changed subtly with atmospheric pressure, while the behavior of fish and marine life reflected conditions that human senses could barely detect. During his first major storm on the island, John experienced the full power of tropical weather from the perspective of someone completely dependent on natural shelter. The wind built gradually from gentle trade breezes to a howling force that bent palm trees nearly horizontal and drove rain with the intensity of bullets. His carefully constructed shelter proved its worth, shedding water and deflecting wind while providing a secure refuge that allowed him to ride out the storm in relative comfort. The experience taught him profound respect for the forces of nature while confirming his growing ability to work with rather than against the island's natural systems. As John's understanding of the island's ecosystem deepened, he began to see it not as a wilderness to be conquered, but as a carefully balanced garden that had been tended by natural forces for countless generations. Every plant, every animal, every geological feature served multiple purposes in maintaining the delicate equilibrium that made life possible in this isolated paradise. The coconut palms that lined the beach were more than just a source of food and building materials. They were the island's first line of defense against storms, surge, and erosion. Their deep root systems held the sandy soil in place, while their flexible trunks could bend with hurricane-force winds without breaking. The fallen fronds created a natural mulch that retained moisture and slowly decomposed to enrich the soil, while the palms themselves provided nesting sites for birds whose droppings fertilized the entire coastal ecosystem. Deeper in the island's interior, John discovered fruit trees that seemed to ripen in careful succession, ensuring a continuous food supply throughout the year. Breadfruit trees produced their starchy bounty during certain seasons, while mangoes, papayas, and other tropical fruits ripened at different times, creating a natural calendar of abundance that required only patience and observation to fully utilize. The stream that provided his fresh water was itself a complex ecosystem that supported life far beyond its banks. Fish swam in its deeper pools, while freshwater shrimp and other crustaceans cleaned algae from the rocks and helped maintain water quality. The stream's flow varied with rainfall patterns, teaching John to conserve water during dry periods and take advantage of abundance during the wet season. John began to actively participate in this natural garden, not by imposing artificial changes, but by working with existing patterns to enhance productivity. He learned which seeds could be planted to encourage useful plants in areas where they might not naturally occur, and how to create small clearings that would attract fruit-bearing trees. His interventions were so subtle that they seemed like natural processes, guided by an understanding of ecological principles that went far beyond anything he had learned in his engineering education. Time on the island moved to rhythms far older and more reliable than any human calendar. John learned to mark the passage of months not by numbered days, but by the subtle shifts in wind patterns, the changing angle of the sun, and the cyclical abundance of different food sources. This natural calendar connected him to the fundamental forces that governed life on Earth, creating a sense of belonging that transcended his temporary status as a castaway. The wet season announced itself gradually, with afternoon clouds building higher and more frequently, eventually coalescing into the daily thunderstorms that recharged the island's freshwater supplies. These storms followed predictable patterns, building through the afternoon heat, reaching their peak in early evening, then dissipating to leave the air clean and cool for peaceful nights. John learned to time his activities around these daily weather cycles, working during the clear mornings and taking shelter during the afternoon deluges. During the wet season, the island transformed into an even more lush paradise. Streams that had been mere trickles during dry periods became rushing torrents that carved new channels and created temporary waterfalls. The forest canopy grew so dense that walking beneath it was like moving through a green cathedral where sunlight filtered down in shafts of golden illumination. Flowers bloomed in profusion, filling the air with fragrances that seemed almost intoxicating in their intensity. The dry season brought different gifts and challenges. Trade winds blew more consistently, keeping temperatures comfortable and providing ideal conditions for fishing and ocean activities. Fruits that had been scarce during the wet season now ripened in abundance, while the clearer skies made it easier to spot potential rescue vessels on the distant horizon. The reduced rainfall meant more careful water management, but also less humidity and fewer insects. John's body adapted to these seasonal rhythms in ways that surprised him. During the wet season, he found himself naturally inclined toward indoor activities, maintaining his shelter, crafting tools, and processing foods for storage. The dry season energized him for more active pursuits, exploring new areas of the island, fishing in the deeper waters beyond the reef, and working on larger construction projects. His sleep patterns shifted with the changing length of days, while his appetite varied with the availability of different food sources. The reef that surrounded John's island was far more than a protective barrier. It was a living city whose complexity and beauty rivaled anything created by human civilization. During calm periods when the lagoon was crystal clear, John could spend hours simply observing the intricate life that played out in this underwater metropolis. Each coral head was like an apartment building, housing hundreds of different species and relationships so complex they seemed almost miraculous. The coral itself was a marvel of biological engineering, built by tiny polyps that extracted calcium carbonate from seawater to create structures of incredible beauty and strength. Brain coral formed massive domes with surfaces that looked exactly like the convolutions of human gray matter, while staghorn coral created delicate branching structures that provided shelter for countless small fish. Table coral spread in flat platforms that caught and concentrated sunlight for the algae that lived symbiotically within the coral tissues. Fish of every conceivable color and pattern made their homes within this coral city. Parrotfish, with their powerful beaks designed for scraping algae from coral surfaces, played a crucial role in maintaining the reef's health while creating much of the white sand that formed the island's beaches. Angelfish and butterflyfish displayed color patterns so intricate they seemed painted by master artists, while cleaner fish established stations where larger species would queue patiently to have parasites removed. The reef's daily cycles fascinated John almost as much as its structural complexity. During daylight hours, it was a bustling metropolis of activity as fish fed, cleaned, and went about their daily business. As evening approached, the day's shift gradually gave way to night dwellers. Eels emerged from crevices, octopi began their hunting expeditions, and bioluminescent creatures created underwater light shows that rivaled any human fireworks display. John learned to harvest the reef's bounty with the same respect and restraint that governed all his interactions with the island's ecosystems. Fish could be caught in quantities sufficient for his needs without depleting the populations that maintained the reef's balance. Shellfish and crustaceans provided variety in his diet, while their shells contributed useful materials for tools and construction. The reef gave generously to those who understood its rhythms and took only what was needed for survival. In his previous life, John had been caught up in the endless pursuit of more success, more possessions, more experiences to fill time that always seemed insufficient. On the island, he discovered a different philosophy entirely, one based on the concept of enough. When basic needs were met through the island's natural abundance, the frantic pursuit of excess became not only unnecessary but counterproductive. Each day brought exactly what was needed for that day's survival and comfort. The coconut palm provided enough water and nutrition for immediate needs, while tomorrow's requirements would be met by tomorrow's harvest. Fish could be caught in sufficient quantities for current consumption, with any excess preserved for future use through time-tested methods of drying and smoking. This natural rhythm of sufficiency created a sense of security that John had never experienced in his previous life of constant striving. The island taught patience in ways that no human teacher ever could. Fruit ripened in its own time, regardless of human desire or schedule. Tides followed their ancient patterns without regard for human convenience. Weather systems developed and dissipated according to forces far greater than individual will. Learning to work within these natural constraints rather than fighting against them brought a peace that John had never imagined possible. Time itself took on different meaning when measured by natural cycles rather than artificial schedules. A day was complete when its tasks were finished and its gifts received, regardless of how many hours had passed. A week was meaningful only in terms of weather patterns and tidal cycles. Months were marked by the changing abundance of different food sources and the gradual shift in seasonal patterns. This philosophy of enough extended beyond material needs to encompass emotional and spiritual fulfillment. The simple pleasure of watching a sunset became as satisfying as any entertainment his previous life had offered. The sound of waves on coral provided music more beautiful than any concert hall could produce. The company of seabirds and the whisper of trade winds through palm fronds offered companionship that required no words and made no demands beyond simple appreciation. In the profound solitude of his island existence, John became the keeper of memories that stretched far beyond his own experience. The island itself seemed to hold stories in its coral formations, its ancient trees, and the patterns of erosion that spoke of countless storms weathered and seasons endured. He began to see himself not as an intruder in this paradise, but as the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding for millennia. The massive coral heads in the lagoon told tales of patient growth spanning centuries. Each layer represented years of slow accumulation, building structures that would outlast any human construction. John learned to read these coral chronicles like geological books, understanding how changes in sea level and climate had shaped the reef over generations. The oldest coral formations had witnessed the passage of Polynesian navigators, Spanish explorers, and countless natural cycles that connected his temporary presence to the vast sweep of Pacific history. Ancient trees in the island's interior carried their own memories in the patterns of their growth rings and the scars left by long-ago storms. A massive banyan tree near the island's center showed evidence of lightning strikes that had split its trunk decades earlier, yet it continued to thrive, its aerial roots creating a natural cathedral that seemed designed for contemplation. John often sat beneath this ancient giant, feeling connected to all the seasons it had witnessed and all the creatures it had sheltered. The beach itself was a library of memories written in sand and stone. Pieces of coral worn smooth by centuries of wave action told stories of reefs that had lived and died in the endless cycle of growth and erosion. Shells from creatures that had lived their entire lives in these waters carried the history of countless generations, while occasional pieces of driftwood bore witness to storms and currents that connected this small island to distant continents. John began to add his own memories to this natural archive, not through any deliberate attempt to leave permanent marks, but through the simple act of living in harmony with the island's rhythms. His daily paths through the forest gradually became established trails that would guide future visitors. His careful harvesting of fruits and nuts encouraged the growth of useful plants in areas where they might not have naturally flourished. His presence became part of the island's ongoing story, written in actions rather than words. The twice-daily rhythm of the tides became the heartbeat of John's existence, a natural metronome that organized his activities and thoughts with a precision that no human timepiece could match. High tide brought the lagoon's waters nearly to the edge of his camp, creating a temporary world where swimming and fishing were effortless pleasures. Low tide revealed hidden treasures and provided access to areas of the reef that were otherwise submerged beneath fathoms of crystal-clear water. Each tide was unique, influenced by the complex interaction of moon phases, weather patterns, and seasonal changes that created an ever-shifting schedule of opportunities and challenges. Spring tides, occurring during new and full moons, brought the highest highs and lowest lows, revealing parts of the reef that remained hidden during other times. These extreme tides provided access to the deepest tidal pools and the richest shellfish beds, but also required careful timing to avoid being stranded in areas that could become dangerous when the water returned. The neap tides that occurred during quarter moons brought smaller variations but more predictable patterns, creating ideal conditions for activities that required stable water levels. John learned to plan his major projects around these tidal cycles, understanding that working with natural rhythms was far more efficient than fighting against them. Construction projects were timed to take advantage of low tides that provided access to materials, while fishing expeditions were planned around high tides that brought fish into the shallower areas of the lagoon. The sound of tides became a constant companion that provided information about weather conditions, seasonal changes, and even the time of day. During calm periods, the gentle lapping of waves on coral created a soothing rhythm that promoted peaceful sleep. When storms approached, the sound intensified to a more urgent percussion that served as an early warning system. John learned to distinguish between the sounds of incoming and outgoing tides, the difference between waves driven by local winds and swells from distant storms. The tidal pools that formed during low tide became windows into marine ecosystems of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Each pool was a complete world in miniature, containing fish, crustaceans, sea anemones, and algae in relationships that had evolved over millions of years. John spent countless hours observing these temporary aquariums, learning about marine biology through direct observation rather than textbooks. The pools taught patience, as their inhabitants would only reveal themselves to observers who could remain still and quiet for extended periods. As John's basic survival needs became routine, he discovered that the human spirit required more than just food, water, and shelter to truly thrive. The island provided not only the materials for physical survival, but also the inspiration and resources for creative expression that fed his soul in ways he had never experienced. His engineering background, combined with the natural beauty that surrounded him, began to manifest in creations that were both functional and artistic. The process of crafting tools and improving his shelter evolved from mere necessity into a form of meditation and artistic expression. Each piece of bamboo was selected not only for its structural properties, but also for its natural beauty and the way it would complement other materials in the finished work. Lashings made from coconut fiber were arranged in patterns that served both functional and aesthetic purposes, creating joints that were as pleasing to the eye as they were strong and durable. John began to create objects that served no practical purpose other than beauty and the satisfaction of creation itself. Shells collected during low-tide expeditions were arranged in patterns that caught and reflected sunlight in pleasing ways. Pieces of coral, weathered wood, and volcanic stone were combined into sculptures that seemed to grow naturally from their surroundings. These creations required no audience other than the birds and the wind, yet they provided a sense of accomplishment and joy that enriched his daily existence immeasurably. The island itself became his canvas for larger artistic expressions. Paths through the forest were designed not just for efficiency, but to reveal the most beautiful views and create a sense of journey and discovery. Clearings were shaped to frame particular vistas or create natural amphitheaters where birds' songs seemed to resonate with perfect acoustics. His camp evolved from a simple survival shelter into a harmonious arrangement of structures that seemed to belong to the landscape as naturally as the trees and coral formations. The act of creation connected John to something larger than his individual survival. Working with natural materials required an understanding of their properties and limitations that went beyond mere technical knowledge. Wood had grain patterns that suggested certain uses, while shells and stones had shapes that seemed to call out for specific artistic treatments. Learning to listen to these material voices and respond with appropriate techniques became a form of communication with the natural world that transcended language. Water, in all its forms and manifestations, became John's greatest teacher on the island. The stream that provided his drinking water demonstrated the principles of persistence and adaptability, finding ways around obstacles that seemed immovable and carving channels through solid rock through the patient application of gentle but constant pressure. Watching the stream's behavior during different seasons taught lessons about resource management, conservation, and the importance of working with natural cycles rather than against them. Rain arrived in patterns that reflected the complex interaction of ocean currents, atmospheric pressure, and seasonal changes. John learned to read the subtle signs that preceded different types of precipitation, the brief, intense downpours that could fill his water containers in minutes, the gentle mists that nourished plants without creating runoff, and the steady rains that could last for days and transform the entire character of the island. Each type of rain required different responses and provided different opportunities for water collection and storage. The lagoon's crystal-clear water served as both mirror and window, reflecting the sky's changing moods while revealing the complex ecosystem that thrived beneath the surface. The water's transparency allowed John to observe marine life with a clarity that would have been impossible in less pristine environments. He could watch fish feeding, courting, and caring for their young, learning about marine behavior through direct observation rather than scientific texts. Ocean swells carried information from distant places, their size and direction telling stories of storms hundreds of miles away and weather patterns that would affect the island days or weeks in the future. John learned to read these liquid messages like a maritime language, understanding how different types of swells indicated different weather conditions and seasonal changes. The ocean became his connection to the wider world, a source of information about conditions far beyond his small island paradise. The sound of water in its various forms provided a constant soundtrack that seemed designed to promote peace and contemplation. The gentle murmur of the stream created a natural white noise that masked less pleasant sounds and promoted restful sleep. Waves on the reef provided rhythmic percussion that varied with weather and tidal conditions, while rain on palm fronds created delicate melodies that seemed composed by nature herself. John found that he could determine weather conditions, tidal states, and even the time of day simply by listening to the various water sounds that surrounded his island home. As John completed his first full year on the island, he began to understand the profound wisdom embedded in natural cycles. The seasons did not simply repeat themselves in mechanical fashion, but spiraled through variations that created an ever-changing tapestry of experience while maintaining underlying patterns that provided stability and predictability. Each season brought its own gifts and challenges, its own lessons and opportunities for growth. The wet season's return brought a sense of completion and renewal that connected John to the fundamental rhythms of life itself. The first storms of the new wet season seemed to wash away the accumulated dust and heat of the dry months, refreshing both the landscape and John's spirit with the promise of abundance and growth. Plants that had merely survived during the drier months burst into new growth, while dormant seeds sprouted in response to the life-giving moisture. The island's wildlife responded to seasonal changes with behaviors that revealed the deep connections between all living things. Birds that had been relatively quiet during certain months burst into song during mating seasons, their calls creating natural concerts that seemed timed to coincide with the blooming of particular flowers. Fish populations shifted with changing water temperatures and food availability, while marine creatures followed reproductive cycles that had been established over millions of years of evolution. John's own body and mind adapted to these seasonal rhythms in ways that surprised him. His energy levels, sleep patterns, and even his emotional states seemed to fluctuate in harmony with the natural cycles around him. During the wet season, he found himself naturally inclined toward introspective activities, maintaining his shelter, crafting tools, and simply observing the abundant life that flourished in the increased moisture. The dry season energized him for more active pursuits and exploration. The completion of his first full seasonal cycle brought with it a profound sense of belonging that transcended his status as a temporary castaway. He had witnessed the island through all its moods and seasons, had learned to work with its rhythms rather than against them, and had found his place within the complex web of relationships that sustained life in this isolated paradise. The island was no longer a foreign environment to be conquered, but a home where he belonged as naturally as the palm trees and coral formations that had welcomed him from the sea. As John's second year on the island began, he realized that he had become fluent in a language he never knew existed, the complex communications system of the island's bird population. What had once seemed like random chirping and calling had revealed itself to be an intricate network of information sharing that connected every corner of his small paradise. The birds served as the island's news service, weather forecasters, and early warning system all rolled into one melodious communication network. The dawn chorus that greeted each morning was far more than a simple celebration of sunrise. John learned to distinguish between the territorial calls of male birds establishing their daily boundaries, the contact calls of mated pairs coordinating their activities, and the alarm calls that warned of approaching weather or unusual disturbances. Each species contributed its own voice to this natural symphony, creating layers of meaning that revealed the island's daily rhythms and seasonal changes. Seabirds provided the most reliable weather forecasting service John had ever encountered. Frigate birds soaring high overhead could detect atmospheric pressure changes hours before they became apparent to human senses, their flight patterns shifting subtly to indicate approaching storms or clearing weather. Terns and other fishing birds altered their feeding behaviors in response to changes in ocean conditions, their activities providing information about fish populations, water temperature, and current patterns. The forest birds served as the island's security system, their alarm calls alerting John to any unusual activity in areas he couldn't directly observe. A sudden silence in the forest canopy often indicated the presence of a predator or some other disturbance, while the gradual return of normal calling patterns signaled that whatever had caused the alarm had passed. John learned to interpret these vocal patterns as accurately as any electronic monitoring system. During his quiet evening hours, John began to experiment with his own contributions to this avian conversation. Certain whistles and calls would elicit responses from nearby birds, creating brief dialogues that seemed to bridge the gap between human and animal communication. While he never achieved true fluency in bird language, these simple exchanges created a sense of community and belonging that enriched his solitary existence in ways he had never anticipated. Fire had been humanity's first great technology, and on the island, John rediscovered the profound relationship between human survival and the controlled use of flame. What had been a simple convenience in his previous life, the flick of a switch or the turn of a knob, became a sacred responsibility that required constant attention, respect, and understanding of natural principles that connected him to his earliest ancestors. Maintaining fire in a tropical environment presented unique challenges that tested John's ingenuity and patience. The high humidity could make tinder damp and difficult to ignite, while sudden tropical downpours could extinguish carefully tended flames in seconds. John learned to create fire-starting materials that could function even in adverse conditions. Dry tinder stored in waterproof containers made from large shells, kindling kept in elevated shelters that protected it from ground moisture, and techniques for quickly rekindling flames from carefully preserved coals. The process of creating fire without modern tools became a meditation on patience and preparation. John mastered the bow drill method, using dry bamboo and coconut husk fiber to create the friction necessary to generate the tiny ember that could be nursed into flame. Each successful fire-making session required perfect coordination of materials, technique, and timing, a dance between human skill and natural properties that could not be rushed or forced. Fire served purposes far beyond simple cooking and warmth. Smoke from carefully chosen materials could preserve fish and meat for long-term storage, while controlled burns could clear areas for planting useful crops or create fire breaks that would protect his camp from potential wildfires. The light from flames extended his useful day into the evening hours, providing illumination for crafting projects and creating a sense of security during the tropical nights. The psychological importance of fire proved as significant as its practical applications. The dancing flames provided companionship during long evenings, their hypnotic movement and warm glow creating a focal point for contemplation and reflection. The crackling sounds of burning wood added another layer to the island's natural soundtrack, while the scent of wood smoke carried associations with comfort and home that transcended cultural boundaries. Fire connected John to the long chain of human experience, reminding him that he was part of a species that had survived and thrived through mastery of this elemental force. The island's plant life revealed itself to be a comprehensive pharmacy stocked with remedies for ailments John had never considered treating without modern medicine. Through careful observation, cautious experimentation, and attention to the way animals used various plants, he discovered a natural healthcare system that had been operating successfully for millions of years before humans invented synthetic drugs. Aloe plants growing in the sunnier areas of the island provided immediate relief for the minor cuts, scrapes, and sunburn that were inevitable consequences of outdoor living. The clear gel inside the thick leaves had cooling and healing properties that seemed almost miraculous in their effectiveness. John learned to harvest this natural medicine sustainably, taking only what he needed while ensuring the plants could continue to thrive and provide future treatments. The island's diverse plant community included natural antiseptics, pain relievers, and digestive aids that could address most common health issues. Tea brewed from certain leaves could settle an upset stomach or promote restful sleep, while other plants provided compounds that could reduce inflammation or fight infection. John approached this natural pharmacy with the same systematic methodology he had once applied to engineering problems, carefully testing small amounts of new remedies and observing their effects before incorporating them into his healthcare routine. The process of learning about medicinal plants connected John to traditional knowledge systems that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. He began to understand how indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated understanding of plant medicine through generations of careful observation and experimentation. This knowledge had been encoded in cultural practices and passed down through oral traditions that modern medicine was only beginning to appreciate and understand. Beyond treating specific ailments, the island's plant medicine taught John about prevention and maintaining overall health through natural means. Certain fruits and leaves provided vitamins and minerals that prevented deficiency diseases, while others contained compounds that supported immune system function and overall vitality. The act of gathering and preparing these natural medicines became a form of healthcare that addressed not just physical symptoms, but also the psychological and spiritual aspects of well-being. As John's survival skills became second nature, he began to focus on creating not just shelter, but genuine comfort that would make his island existence as pleasant as possible. His engineering background proved invaluable in designing improvements that maximized efficiency while minimizing effort, creating systems that worked with natural forces rather than against them. His original shelter evolved into a sophisticated dwelling that took advantage of every aspect of the island's microclimate. Walls were positioned to channel cooling breezes while blocking harsh sun and driving rain. Windows and vents were strategically placed to create natural air conditioning that kept the interior comfortable even during the hottest parts of the day. The roof design incorporated multiple levels and overhangs that shed water efficiently while creating covered outdoor spaces for various activities. Water management became a masterpiece of practical engineering that would have impressed his former colleagues. Gutters made from split bamboo collected rainwater from every surface and channeled it into storage containers strategically positioned throughout his compound. A series of settling tanks and sand filters created a water treatment system that ensured a constant supply of clean, fresh water even during extended dry periods. Overflow systems prevented waste while protecting against flooding during heavy rains. The kitchen area evolved into an outdoor culinary center that rivaled any modern facility in terms of functionality and efficiency. Multiple fire pits served different cooking purposes. One optimized for quick, high-heat cooking, another designed for slow smoking and food preservation, and a third configured as a bread oven using heated stones. Work surfaces were positioned to take advantage of natural lighting and cooling breezes, while storage areas kept food supplies organized and protected from moisture and pests. John's furniture, crafted entirely from materials the island provided, demonstrated that comfort and beauty could be achieved without sacrificing sustainability. Chairs and tables were designed to complement the human body while showcasing the natural beauty of bamboo, driftwood, and woven fibers. Sleeping areas incorporated natural materials that provided support and comfort, while allowing air circulation that prevented the humidity problems that could plague tropical dwellings. 2 years of island life had transformed John from a successful engineer into something approaching a natural philosopher, someone who had learned to find profound meaning in the simple act of living in harmony with natural systems. The forced simplicity of his existence had stripped away the distractions and complications of modern life, revealing truths about human nature and happiness that had been obscured by the complexity of civilization. The concept of success had undergone a complete transformation in John's mind, where once he had measured achievement in terms of career advancement, financial gain, and social recognition, he now found satisfaction in much simpler accomplishments, successfully predicting weather changes, crafting a particularly elegant tool, or simply experiencing a perfect sunset without the distraction of urgent obligations. These small victories provided a sense of fulfillment that his previous achievements had never quite delivered. Time itself had become a friend rather than an enemy. Without clocks and schedules, John discovered that there was always enough time for whatever truly needed to be done. Tasks were completed when they were finished rather than when some arbitrary deadline demanded, and this natural pacing created a sense of peace and satisfaction that constant hurry had never allowed. The pressure to multitask disappeared when each activity could receive complete attention and be fully experienced. The relationship between effort and reward had been clarified by the island's honest feedback systems. Hard work produced tangible results that directly improved his quality of life, while laziness led to immediate consequences that couldn't be avoided or delegated to others. This direct connection between action and outcome created a sense of personal responsibility and empowerment that had been diluted by the complex systems of modern society. Most profoundly, John had discovered that happiness was not something to be pursued or achieved, but rather something that emerged naturally when basic needs were met and life was lived in harmony with natural rhythms. The constant striving for more that had characterized his previous existence had been replaced by a deep appreciation for what was already present. Each day brought its own gifts and challenges, and the simple act of being fully present for these experiences provided a richness and satisfaction that no external achievement could match. As John's third year on the island began, his dreams took on a quality unlike anything he had experienced in his previous life. The profound silence of tropical nights, broken only by the gentle sounds of waves and wind, created perfect conditions for sleep that was both deeper and more vivid than he had ever known. His dreams became journeys that seemed to connect him not only to his past, but to the island's ancient history and the vast ocean that surrounded his small paradise. In these nocturnal voyages, John found himself sailing with Polynesian navigators who had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars, currents, and bird flight patterns as their guides. These dream journeys felt more real than memory, filled with the sensation of wind-driven spray and the rhythm of outrigger canoes cutting through Pacific swells. He would wake with knowledge of navigation techniques that he had never studied, understanding star patterns and ocean signs that seemed to have been absorbed through some mysterious osmosis. The island itself appeared in his dreams as a living entity with its own consciousness and memory. He would find himself walking through forests that existed in different time periods, witnessing the arrival of the first seeds carried by ocean currents, the establishment of the first coral polyps, and the gradual evolution of the ecosystem that now sustained his life. These dreams provided a sense of continuity and belonging that connected his temporary presence to the island's eternal existence. Sometimes his dreams carried him back to his former life, but with a perspective that had been transformed by his island experience. He would revisit conversations with friends and colleagues, understanding them now with a clarity that had been impossible when he was caught up in the daily rush of modern existence. These dream meetings often felt like opportunities to complete unfinished business, to express gratitude or forgiveness that had been left unsaid in his previous life. The boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness began to blur in ways that enriched both states of awareness. Insights gained in dreams would prove useful in solving practical problems during his waking hours, while the peaceful contentment of his daily life created dream experiences that were filled with beauty and wonder rather than the anxiety and confusion that had often characterized his sleep in the civilized world. The ocean's rhythms had become so deeply embedded in John's consciousness that he could sense tidal changes even when he was far from the shore. His body had somehow synchronized with the lunar cycles that governed the rise and fall of waters, creating an internal clock that was more accurate than any timepiece he had ever owned. This intimate connection with tidal forces opened new dimensions of understanding about the fundamental forces that shaped life on Earth. During the extreme low tides that occurred during certain moon phases, John discovered underwater caves and coral formations that remained hidden during normal tidal cycles. These secret chambers, revealed only during the lowest waters, contained marine life that existed nowhere else on the reef. Exploring these temporary windows into hidden worlds required careful timing and respect for the powerful forces that could trap an unwary explorer when the waters returned. The highest tides brought their own revelations, carrying nutrients and marine life into areas that were normally dry land. These tidal surges created temporary ecosystems in the upper reaches of the lagoon, where fish that normally lived in deeper waters could be observed in the crystal-clear shallows. John learned to position himself to take advantage of these brief opportunities, gathering food and materials that were otherwise inaccessible. The sound of tides became a language that conveyed information about weather conditions hundreds of miles away. Swells generated by distant storms would arrive days before the weather systems that created them, their rhythm and intensity providing advance warning of approaching conditions. John learned to read these liquid messages with the skill of a meteorologist, understanding how different wave patterns indicated different types of weather systems and their likely impact on his island home. The psychological effects of living so closely attuned to tidal rhythms proved as significant as the practical benefits. The twice-daily cycle of high and low water created natural periods of activity and rest that seemed perfectly designed for human well-being. High tide encouraged swimming, fishing, and water-based activities, while low tide provided opportunities for gathering, exploration, and land-based projects. This natural rhythm eliminated the need for artificial scheduling while ensuring that each day contained a balanced mix of different types of activities. John's relationship with food had evolved far beyond simple sustenance into something approaching culinary alchemy. The island's natural abundance, combined with techniques learned through experimentation and observation, allowed him to create meals that would have impressed the finest chefs in his former world. Cooking became a creative art that engaged all his senses while connecting him to the fundamental processes that sustained life. The variety of flavors available from the island's natural pantry seemed almost infinite when approached with creativity and understanding. Fish could be prepared in dozens of different ways. Grilled over open flames, wrapped in leaves and steamed in underground ovens, smoked for preservation, or prepared raw in combinations with tropical fruits and natural seasonings. Each preparation method brought out different aspects of flavor and texture, creating dining experiences that were both nutritious and deeply satisfying. Fruits and vegetables from the island's forests provided ingredients for combinations that would have been impossible in any restaurant. Breadfruit could be prepared like potatoes, ground into flour, or fermented into a tangy paste that served as a natural seasoning. Coconuts provided not only meat and milk, but also oil for cooking and fiber for food preparation. Wild herbs and spices added complexity to simple dishes, while natural fermentation processes created flavors that developed over time like fine wines. The process of food preparation became a form of meditation that connected John to the sources of his sustenance. Gathering ingredients required knowledge of seasonal patterns and sustainable harvesting techniques that ensured continued abundance. Preparing meals became an opportunity to express gratitude for the island's gifts while creating combinations that honored the natural flavors of each ingredient. Preservation techniques learned through necessity evolved into sophisticated methods for creating a varied diet throughout the year. Fish could be dried, smoked, or fermented to create protein sources that would keep for months. Fruits could be dried in the sun or processed into concentrates that preserved their nutritional value while extending their useful life. Root vegetables could be stored in cool, dry places or processed into forms that would remain edible for extended periods. As John's practical needs became routine, His creative impulses found expression in crafting objects of beauty that served no purpose other than to bring joy and aesthetic pleasure to his daily existence. The island provided materials of extraordinary beauty and variety, while his growing skills allowed him to work with these natural gifts in ways that enhanced rather than diminished their inherent qualities. Shells collected during low-tide expeditions became the raw materials for decorative objects that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. John learned to work with the natural curves and colors of different shell types, creating arrangements that seemed to glow with inner light when positioned to catch the tropical sun. These shell sculptures required no artificial enhancement. Their beauty came from understanding and showcasing the natural properties that millions of years of evolution had perfected. Driftwood weathered by countless miles of ocean travel provided material for sculptures that seemed to capture the essence of wind and wave in solid form. Each piece of wood had its own character, shaped by forces that John could only imagine, and his role as craftsman was to reveal the beauty that already existed within the natural form. Working with driftwood required patience and sensitivity, allowing the material itself to suggest the final form rather than imposing preconceived ideas upon it. Bamboo, with its perfect natural engineering and elegant proportions, became the medium for functional art that combined beauty with utility. John crafted containers, tools, and furniture that showcased bamboo's natural strength and flexibility while creating objects that were pleasing to both eye and hand. The process of working with bamboo taught lessons about natural engineering that complemented his formal education, while revealing design principles that human engineers were only beginning to understand. The act of creation became as important as the finished objects themselves. Working with natural materials required a different kind of attention than John had ever experienced in his engineering career. Instead of forcing materials to conform to predetermined specifications, he learned to listen to what each piece of wood, shell, or bamboo wanted to become. This collaborative approach to craftsmanship created objects that seemed to belong naturally to their environment, while expressing something uniquely human in their conception and execution. 3 years of intimate contact with the island's ecosystem had taught John that his role was not that of master or conqueror, but of guardian and participant in a delicate balance that had been millions of years in the making. Every action he took had consequences that rippled through the interconnected web of life that sustained his paradise, and understanding these connections had become essential to his long-term survival and the island's continued health. His daily activities were guided by principles of sustainability that went far beyond simple conservation. Taking fish from the lagoon required understanding population dynamics and breeding cycles that ensured continued abundance. Harvesting fruits and nuts meant leaving enough for the birds and other creatures that depended on these food sources, while also ensuring that seeds would be dispersed to maintain plant populations. Even gathering materials for construction required careful consideration of how his actions would affect the island's long-term ecological balance. The island had taught John that waste was a human concept that had no place in natural systems. Everything that lived and died on the island became part of the continuous cycle of growth, decay, and renewal that sustained all life. His own waste products were incorporated into this natural recycling system, while materials he no longer needed were returned to the environment in ways that would benefit other organisms. This closed-loop approach to resource use created a sense of responsibility and connection that had been absent from his previous lifestyle. Water management became a perfect example of working with natural systems rather than against them. John's collection and storage systems were designed to mimic the island's natural water cycle, capturing and storing rainwater during abundant periods while using it efficiently during drier times. His consumption patterns followed seasonal availability, using more water when it was abundant and conserving carefully when supplies were limited. This approach ensured a reliable water supply while maintaining the natural flow patterns that sustained the island's vegetation. The responsibility of guardianship extended beyond immediate practical concerns to encompass the island's long-term health and beauty. John found himself thinking not just about his own needs, but about how his actions would affect the island's ability to support life in the future. This long-term perspective created a sense of stewardship that connected him to the generations of creatures that had lived on the island before his arrival and would continue to thrive long after his eventual departure. In the profound quiet of his island existence, John discovered that silence was not merely the absence of noise, but a rich and complex medium that carried its own forms of communication and understanding. The modern world's constant barrage of artificial sounds had masked subtleties of natural communication that became apparent only when electronic interference was completely removed. Learning to read the language of silence opened new dimensions of awareness that transformed his relationship with both the island and himself. The quality of silence changed throughout the day in ways that provided information about weather, wildlife activity, and seasonal patterns. The deep stillness that preceded tropical storms carried a tension that could be felt as much as heard, while the peaceful quiet of clear mornings had an entirely different character that spoke of stable weather and calm seas. John learned to distinguish between the expectant silence that preceded dawn bird songs and the settled quiet of midday heat when most creatures sought shade and rest. Even within apparent silence, layers of subtle sound created a complex acoustic environment that revealed the island's hidden activities. The almost inaudible rustle of leaves and light breezes carried information about wind patterns and weather changes. The distant sound of waves on different parts of the reef indicated tidal conditions and swell directions. The soft movements of small creatures in the underbrush told stories of feeding patterns and territorial behaviors that were invisible to casual observation. John's own presence in this acoustic environment became something to be managed and understood. His footsteps, breathing, and movements created disturbances that could alert wildlife to his presence or mask important environmental sounds. Learning to move quietly through the forest required not just physical skill, but an understanding of how sound traveled through different environments, and how his actions affected the natural acoustic balance of his surroundings. The psychological effects of living within this natural soundscape proved as significant as the practical benefits. The absence of mechanical noise allowed his nervous system to relax in ways that had been impossible in his previous urban environment. Sleep became deeper and more restorative when not interrupted by traffic, machinery, or electronic devices. Concentration improved when his attention wasn't constantly fractured by artificial sounds demanding immediate response. The natural rhythms of his own body became more apparent when not masked by the constant stimulation of modern life. The island's healing influence extended far beyond the physical remedies found in its plant pharmacy to encompass a form of psychological and spiritual medicine that addressed wounds John hadn't even realized he carried. The enforced simplicity of his existence had stripped away the layers of stress, anxiety, and artificial urgency that had accumulated during his years in the modern world, revealing a core of peace and contentment that had been buried beneath the demands of contemporary life. The absence of constant decision-making about trivial matters freed mental energy for deeper contemplation and genuine problem-solving. Without the daily barrage of choices about what to wear, what to eat from endless options, or how to spend discretionary time, John's mind could focus on questions that actually mattered. This mental clarity brought insights about his previous life that had been impossible to achieve while caught up in its daily demands. The natural rhythms of island life provided a form of therapy that no human counselor could have designed. The daily cycle of sunrise and sunset created natural boundaries between activity and rest that eliminated the artificial extension of productive hours that had characterized his previous lifestyle. Seasonal changes provided longer cycles of variety and renewal that prevented the stagnation that could result from too much routine. Weather patterns introduced elements of unpredictability that kept life interesting while teaching acceptance of forces beyond human control. Physical activity became integrated into daily life in ways that provided both practical benefits and psychological satisfaction. Unlike the artificial exercise routines of his former life, every physical effort on the island served a clear purpose and produced tangible results. Swimming wasn't just exercise, but transportation and food gathering. Walking wasn't just fitness, but exploration and resource collection. This integration of physical activity with meaningful purpose created a sense of wholeness that had been missing from his previous compartmentalized lifestyle. The island's beauty provided a constant source of inspiration and joy that fed his soul in ways that no human entertainment could match. Each sunset was unique, each tide brought new discoveries. Each day offered opportunities for wonder and appreciation that required no ticket, reservation, or special equipment. This natural entertainment was always available, always free, and always perfectly suited to his current mood and needs. Without clocks, calendars, or schedules, John discovered that time was not the rigid, linear progression he had always assumed, but a fluid medium that could be shaped and experienced in radically different ways. The island operated on natural cycles that created their own temporal rhythms, teaching him that human concepts of time were arbitrary constructions that often worked against rather than with the natural flow of life. Days were measured not by hours but by the completion of natural cycles and necessary tasks. A day began when the light was sufficient for useful activity and ended when darkness made further work impractical or unnecessary. This natural boundary eliminated the artificial extension of productive time that had characterized his previous life, creating clear distinctions between work and rest that promoted both efficiency and relaxation. Weeks became meaningful only in terms of tidal cycles and weather patterns rather than arbitrary 7-day divisions. The lunar month provided a natural calendar that connected timekeeping to observable celestial events rather than abstract numerical systems. This lunar calendar aligned with many of the island's natural cycles, from tidal extremes to animal behavior patterns, creating a timekeeping system that was both practical and deeply connected to natural rhythms. Seasons provided the longest meaningful time divisions, marked by changes in weather patterns, plant growth cycles, and animal behaviors rather than arbitrary calendar dates. The wet season and dry season each brought their own character and opportunities, creating natural variety that prevented the monotony that could result from too much routine. These seasonal changes provided natural goals and projects that gave structure to longer time periods without the artificial pressure of human-imposed deadlines. The psychological experience of time changed dramatically when freed from artificial constraints. Without the constant pressure of schedules and appointments, each moment could be fully experienced rather than rushed through in anticipation of the next obligation. Tasks could be completed at their natural pace, allowing for the satisfaction of thorough work and attention to detail. This unhurried approach to time created a sense of abundance and peace that had been impossible to achieve in his previous time-pressured existence. As John's fourth year on the island began, his relationships with the various creatures that shared his paradise had evolved into something approaching diplomatic relations between different species. Each type of animal had its own personality, needs, and communication style, and learning to coexist peacefully required understanding and respecting these differences while establishing boundaries that worked for all parties involved. The hermit crabs that scuttled along the beach had become his most reliable neighbors, their presence indicating healthy tidal conditions and their absence warning of potential problems. John learned to avoid disturbing their shell-swapping activities while appreciating their role in keeping the beach clean of organic debris. In return, the crabs seemed to accept his presence as part of the natural landscape, continuing their activities even when he was nearby. Seabirds presented more complex diplomatic challenges, as different species had different tolerance levels for human presence and different territorial requirements. The frigate birds that soared overhead were content to ignore him as long as he didn't interfere with their fishing activities, while the smaller terns required more careful management of his movements near their nesting areas. John learned to time his beach activities to avoid disrupting bird feeding schedules while positioning himself to observe their behaviors without causing stress. The fish populations in the lagoon responded to his presence with varying degrees of wariness and acceptance. Some species seemed almost curious about this unusual land-dwelling creature that occasionally entered their domain, while others maintained careful distances that John learned to respect. His fishing activities were conducted with an understanding of fish behavior patterns that allowed him to harvest what he needed without disrupting the complex social structures that governed life in the lagoon. Land crabs presented the most challenging diplomatic relations, as their territorial nature and nocturnal habits often brought them into conflict with John's activities. Learning to coexist required understanding their movement patterns, respecting their burrow systems, and timing his own activities to minimize conflicts. The crabs, in turn, seemed to develop a grudging acceptance of his presence, continuing their important ecological functions while adapting to the reality of sharing their island with this unusual resident. 4 years of island life had taught John that happiness was not a destination to be reached or a goal to be achieved, but a quality of attention that could be applied to any moment, no matter how simple or ordinary. The island's gifts were always present for those who knew how to see them, and learning to recognize and appreciate these constant offerings had become perhaps the most valuable skill he had developed during his time in paradise. The simple act of watching sunrise had evolved from a daily routine into a form of meditation that set the tone for each day. No two sunrises were identical. Each brought its own combination of colors, cloud patterns, and atmospheric conditions that created unique displays of natural artistry. Taking time to fully witness and appreciate these daily masterpieces provided a sense of wonder and gratitude that influenced his entire approach to the day ahead. Meals had become ceremonies of appreciation rather than mere fuel stops. Each bite carried the story of its origin: the soil that nourished the plant, the rain that provided water, the sun that powered photosynthesis, and the complex ecological relationships that made each food source possible. This awareness transformed eating from a mechanical necessity into a conscious act of participation in the island's life-giving cycles. Even routine maintenance tasks had taken on qualities of mindfulness and satisfaction when approached with proper attention. Repairing his shelter became an opportunity to work with natural materials and appreciate their properties. Tending his water collection system provided connection to the island's hydrological cycles. Maintaining his tools and equipment created appreciation for the craftsmanship and ingenuity that made his comfortable existence possible. The evening hours, once devoted to passive entertainment in his former life, had become periods of active appreciation and reflection. Watching the stars emerge in the clear tropical sky provided connection to cosmic cycles and celestial navigation principles that had guided human travelers for millennia. Listening to the night sounds of the island created awareness of nocturnal ecosystems and the complex web of life that continued its activities while he slept. These quiet evening moments provided a sense of completion and satisfaction that prepared him for restorative sleep and dreams filled with the beauty and wonder of his island paradise. As John's 5th year on the island drew to a close, he realized that his transformation had reached a point of completion that felt as natural and inevitable as the seasonal cycles he had learned to follow. The man who had once measured success in quarterly reports and annual reviews now found meaning in the daily rhythms of tide and weather, the seasonal patterns of plant growth and animal behavior, and the longer cycles of ecological balance that connected his small island to the vast systems of ocean and atmosphere that sustained all life on Earth. The approaching anniversary of his arrival brought with it a profound sense of gratitude rather than any desire for rescue or return to his former existence. The island had given him gifts that no amount of money could purchase: perfect health, peace of mind, creative fulfillment, and a deep understanding of his place in the natural world. The stress-related ailments that had plagued his previous life had disappeared completely, replaced by a vitality and energy that seemed to increase rather than diminish with each passing year. His daily routines had evolved into a perfect balance of necessary work and pure enjoyment that eliminated the artificial distinction between labor and leisure that had characterized modern life. Gathering food was also exploration and exercise. Maintaining his shelter was also creative expression and problem-solving. Observing wildlife was simultaneously education, entertainment, and spiritual practice. This integration of purpose and pleasure had created a lifestyle that was both sustainable and deeply satisfying. The island itself had become not just his home, but an extension of his own being. He could sense weather changes in his bones, predict tidal conditions by the quality of light, and read the health of the ecosystem in countless subtle signs that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. This intimate connection with his environment provided a sense of belonging and security that no human institution had ever offered. Looking back on his former life, John felt no regret or longing for what he had left behind. The achievements that had once seemed so important now appeared as arbitrary markers in a game whose rules he no longer understood or respected. The relationships that had been complicated by competition, obligation, and mutual dependence had been replaced by simple, honest connections with the creatures that shared his island paradise. He had discovered that solitude was not loneliness when one was truly at home in the world. In the profound solitude of his island existence, John had become a teacher whose only students were the wind and waves, yet the lessons he had learned seemed too valuable to remain unshared. He began to imagine how he might communicate these insights to others, not through any expectation of rescue or return to civilization, but as a way of organizing and preserving the wisdom that his unique experience had provided. The art of living in harmony with natural systems could not be taught through books or lectures, but required direct experience and patient observation. Yet the principles underlying this harmony were universal truths that could benefit anyone willing to slow down enough to perceive them. The importance of working with natural rhythms rather than against them, the value of simplicity over complexity, the satisfaction of meaningful work over artificial entertainment. These lessons transcended the specific circumstances of island survival. John began to craft messages that he placed in bottles and released to the ocean currents, not with any expectation that they would reach human recipients, but as a way of articulating the insights that his island experience had provided. These messages were addressed to no one in particular and everyone in general, carrying observations about the nature of happiness, the relationship between humans and their environment, and the possibility of finding fulfillment through alignment with natural principles. The process of writing these messages became a form of teaching that benefited the teacher as much as any potential student. Putting his experiences into words required him to examine and organize insights that had been absorbed through direct experience. The act of communication, even to unknown and possibly non-existent recipients, created a sense of connection to the larger human community that enriched his solitary existence without diminishing his contentment with island life. Some messages focused on practical wisdom, techniques for reading weather patterns, methods for sustainable resource use, approaches to problem solving that worked with rather than against natural forces. Others addressed philosophical questions about the nature of progress, the definition of success, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and environmental health. All carried the underlying message that human happiness was not only compatible with ecological balance, but actually depended upon it. As John walked the familiar paths of his island home, he reflected on the traces his presence had left on this small paradise, and the much larger impact the island had made on him. His footprints in the sand were washed away by each tide, but the deeper impressions of his 5-year residence would remain long after his eventual departure, woven into the island's ongoing story in ways both visible and invisible. The fruit trees he had planted and tended would continue to provide food for future visitors, both human and animal. His careful selection of useful species and his understanding of the island's growing conditions had created small groves of breadfruit, coconut palms, and other productive plants in locations where they would thrive for decades to come. These living monuments to his presence would serve practical purposes while demonstrating the possibility of human habitation that enhanced rather than degraded natural systems. The trails he had established through the island's interior followed routes that minimized environmental impact while providing access to important resources and scenic viewpoints. Future inhabitants would benefit from these carefully planned pathways that worked with the island's topography rather than against it. The bridges he had built over streams and ravines used techniques that allowed natural water flow while providing safe passage for human travelers. His shelter, constructed entirely from renewable island materials using traditional techniques, would serve as both practical accommodation and educational example for anyone who might follow in his footsteps. The design demonstrated principles of tropical architecture that maximized comfort while minimizing environmental impact. The construction method showcased the possibilities of building with natural materials in ways that complemented rather than competed with the surrounding ecosystem. Perhaps most importantly, John's 5 years of careful observation and sustainable living had proven that human habitation of such environments was not only possible, but could actually enhance the island's ecological health. His presence had created no pollution, generated no waste that couldn't be absorbed by natural cycles, and consumed no resources faster than they could be renewed. This demonstration of sustainable living provided a model that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human civilization and environmental health. On a morning that seemed no different from thousands of others, John spotted a sail on the horizon that would forever change his relationship with his island paradise. The approaching vessel represented not rescue from an unwanted exile, but a choice between two completely different ways of being in the world. The decision he faced was not whether to leave or stay, but how to carry the wisdom of his island experience into whatever future awaited him. The boat that approached his reef carried researchers studying Pacific ecosystems, people whose work aligned closely with the understanding John had developed through 5 years of intimate observation. Their surprise at finding a healthy, contented castaway was matched by his own amazement at how strange other humans seemed after so many years of solitude. The researchers were fascinated by his sustainable lifestyle and the detailed knowledge he had accumulated about the island's ecological systems. As John considered his options, he realized that his island experience had prepared him for a role he had never imagined, that of translator between the world of natural systems and the world of human institutions. His engineering background, combined with his hard-won understanding of ecological principles, positioned him uniquely to communicate the practical applications of environmental wisdom to people still trapped in unsustainable patterns of living. The choice to leave was ultimately motivated not by dissatisfaction with island life, but by recognition that his insights might benefit others who were searching for alternatives to the destructive patterns of modern civilization. His island paradise would always be part of him, and the principles he had learned there could be applied in any environment where humans were willing to work with rather than against natural systems. The night before his departure, John walked every familiar path one last time, saying goodbye to the places and creatures that had been his companions for 5 transformative years. The hermit crabs scuttled along the beach as they always had, the birds called from the forest canopy, and the waves continued their eternal rhythm against the coral reef. The island would continue its ancient cycles with or without his presence, but he would carry its lessons with him wherever his journey might lead. John's departure from the island marked not an ending, but a transformation of his relationship with paradise from physical presence to spiritual carrying. As the research vessel carried him away from the reef that had been his entire world for 5 years, he understood that he was not leaving paradise behind, but taking it with him in the form of wisdom, perspective, and a fundamentally altered understanding of what it meant to be human in the natural world. The months that followed his rescue were filled with opportunities to share his story and insights with audiences hungry for alternatives to the destructive patterns of modern life. His presentations to environmental groups, his consultations with sustainable development projects, and his writings about island ecology carried the practical wisdom he had gained through direct experience. But more importantly, they carried the deeper message that human fulfillment and environmental health were not competing interests, but aspects of the same fundamental harmony. John's island experience had taught him that paradise was not a place to be found or lost, but a way of being that could be cultivated anywhere humans were willing to align themselves with natural principles. The contentment he had discovered in his island solitude remained with him in more complex environments, providing a center of peace and clarity that no external circumstances could disturb. The skills he had developed on the island, reading natural signs, working with available materials, finding satisfaction in simple pleasures, proved remarkably applicable to life in the modern world. His approach to problem-solving had been fundamentally altered by 5 years of working with rather than against natural forces. His relationships with other people were informed by the patience and acceptance he had learned through observation of wildlife. His material needs had been permanently simplified by the understanding of how little was actually necessary for genuine happiness. As years passed, John often returned to his island, sometimes physically and always spiritually. Each visit confirmed that the lessons he had learned there continued to deepen and evolve. The island remained his teacher, his sanctuary, and his reminder that paradise was not a reward to be earned through struggle, but a natural state to be recognized and embraced wherever life's currents might carry him. In quiet moments, whether surrounded by the complexity of human civilization or the simplicity of natural environments, John could close his eyes and instantly return to the sound of waves on coral, the sight of sunrise over endless ocean, and the profound peace of knowing himself to be at home in the world. He had learned that once paradise is truly found, it can never be lost, because it exists not in any external location, but in the harmony between human consciousness and the natural systems that sustain all life. The island had given him the greatest gift possible, the understanding that he was not separate from nature, but part of it, and that this recognition was the foundation of all genuine happiness, wisdom, and peace.